What's up guys? Today we're in the Thrashin Supply garage and we're gonna show you how to put the Thrashin Supply gauge relocation and top tree on your 14 to 2022 Road Glide. So behind me, I have a brand new 2022 Road Glide ST. It has not even been touched. The handlebars are completely stock. The trees are stock. The gauges are in the stock location. Before I'm even gonna get into working on this bike, to put the Thrashin Supply top tree on that comes with a lock, you're gonna need to remove this stock lock. And the way to do that properly is you're gonna run to your Harley-Davidson dealership and you're gonna get your bike programmed to where you're on a keyless ignition. It takes them about 10 to 15 minutes to do. Call ahead, make sure they can get it done for you, and then you're gonna be able to turn on and off your bike with this and using your key fob. Let's get that done first, then we'll come back to the shop and we'll start diving into this bike. All right, so I just showed up at my local Harley-Davidson dealership. For me, it's Mulholland Harley-Davidson. I'm sure you have one nearby. And what you need to do before you start anything is you need to ask them to do the keyless ignition, which allows you to remove this lock and put the whole starting position in here. That way you'll be able to turn your bike on and off with this switch. As you notice now, it's not doing anything. Once they're done flashing it, you will not need this and everything will work from here. And then you'll be able to use the lock that we supply you with for our top tree. All right, so make sure you call ahead to your local Harley-Davidson dealership and ask them what it's gonna take to do a keyless ignition re-flash for your bike. As you can see, I have Justin here. He's starting to work on it right away. This usually takes about 15 minutes to a half hour to get done. You know, normally they can carve out some time, but I would highly suggest that you plan ahead, call your dealership, kind of get on their schedule so you don't interrupt their day. And then also so it doesn't kind of waste your Saturday or whatever day you're trying to work on it to get it done. All right, so now that the keyless entry has been activated, as you can see, this switch is now in the neutral position and I can turn the bike on right here with just this switch. We're ready to go. If I wanted to, I could start the bike. All right, so we're done here. I'm gonna have Justin button it up. We're gonna head out, head back to the shop and get wrenching on this thing. All right, so we just had the bike flash, so I can start it from here. You notice the ignition is now in the regular neutral position. Just with the switch of that, I'm able to turn the bike on. That's where we want to begin. Now I'm gonna bring Juan in on this. Juan's gonna give me a second set of hands. We're gonna dive into it, start taking it apart, and we're gonna show you step by step what it takes to put your bars and risers, gauge relocation, and top tree on your Road Glide. And I'm hoping this should take less than 4 hours, and that's even kind of taking our time. So we'll kind of keep you in the loop how long it's taking, show you step by step. Let's get it done. Before you start pulling wrenches out, protect your paint. We have a tank cover. You can always just use a beach towel, put something over your gas tank. Juan, what do you have in your hand?
I got some clear tape. We're gonna put this in areas of high contact, maybe in an area where you could have some scratching or something going on, so we wanna protect that. You could also use some blue tape, but this works just fine as well.
Another thing I'm gonna tell you, while Juan goes ahead and he starts putting the clear tape on the bike, we already did jack the bike up with one jack just to get pressure off the front wheel. This allows us to be able to turn the handlebars. You know, when we pull the top tree off, there's no pressure on the forks, and we don't need the bike up on a lift or anything like that. You could work right on the floor. I mean, you could even use a car jack to get your front end off the wheel.
So we're just gonna protect the areas, again, that might see some high contact. We're gonna be removing the windscreen, so in the event that it comes off, we don't wanna have the paint get damaged, so we're gonna hit that area. Another area we like to do is the fender.
Again, if you don't have this tape, you can always use blue tape, and you can always use a beach towel, anything really just to kind of cover your paint so that if you drop the wrench, you drop the bolt, socket, you're not gonna chip your paint.
First thing we're gonna do is gonna take off this little cover. You pry from the back, just lift up, no tools required. You're gonna hear it pop, and then it should come right out. Next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna hit these two Torx bolts. They're a T25. We remove those two bolts, so turn the switch. Should be able to pull out the nacelle. There it is. So I'm just gonna unplug the gauge. Just probably a little Taz, be careful not to break them. There it is. And then Lance's gonna hit the little switches.
All right, so you're gonna continue taking the nacelle off. Grab an extension so you're not near your fairing. Just use the T40 to get the side nacelle bolts out. Make sure that when you are removing the side nacelle, you do take all 4 bolts out, the ones that are a little bit lower on the trees.
Okay, so now you're gonna be able to remove the bottom fairing, and then the other 2 will come out from the top.
So you can see the electronics are connected to this part of the nacelle. If you want to separate those, they are just connected by plastic pins. So one thing that you're going to want to do when you get to this point, you can see all the wires. We're going to need to unplug these wires. I personally like to take a photo with my phone, knowing what is what. I can tell which part's the left one, which part's the right one. I do believe that the plugs are, they only will work in the ones that they go in, but it is wise just to have a photo before you take any wiring apart.
Another thing to note is keep track of the ones that are unplugged, so when you're putting it assembled, you're not trying to figure out where it goes, just because it could be tricky.
One thing for peace of mind is I'm gonna tape the wires that I know were never used. Some of these wires could be auxiliary wires. Some of these wires could be for heated grips, and not all Harley models use them, and some of them can be a little bit different. So it looks like those 2 are the only ones we need to worry about, right, Juan?
Yep, that looks like that's it.
Cool.
So now we can start removing them from this back plastic piece. We're not gonna reuse this, so once you're done with it, get rid of it. So to remove the connector from this back plate, you just, with some needle nose, you press down on them and then should be able to slide out through the bottom. Just do that to all of these plugs, just like that. So those are just 2 zip ties attaching the loom to this. Again, we're not gonna reuse this.
All right, so this would be the last plug that you get undone. You make sure you have all the plugs going into the handlebar detached, and then that way we can take the whole handlebar setup off. So now I have a T27, and I'm going to remove perches off of the handlebars. That will include the clutch and the brake. This way, the handlebars will be able to be removed. Make sure that you are holding the perch so you don't drop it on your fairing. I will later show you why we cannot reuse these perch clamps. So the reason why we recommend you getting our Thrashin Supply billet perch clamps, the stock clamps are very long and they won't even fit in the bend of our style handlebars. And also there's this pin that helps align it so that you cannot rotate your levers too much. As you can see, this pin goes in that hole, and our handlebars do not have this, so you will not be able to use these perch clamps no longer. So next thing, you're gonna grab a 1/4 Allen and take off the handlebars. All right, so there's 2 wires still connected to the tree. One is your lock wire. We're gonna unplug that. Because the bike's flashed, we no longer need this to start the bike. And then there is the ground wire. We're gonna unplug that, you just pull it apart. You no longer need to ground your handlebars or your tree because it is solid mount, metal to metal. And now we're gonna take the top tree off. Keep in mind, you do not need to remove this nut. You don't need to touch it. We're only gonna touch these 3 pinch bolts and take the tree off. All right, so we're gonna start by loosening the pinch bolts on the tree. I have a 1/4 inch Allen. Once those are loose, then I'm gonna grab this 5/16. It's a little bit bigger, main stem pinch bolt.
Got it.
And look at that. The tree is off with the lock. Easy peasy. We got this all disassembled in less than 45 minutes. From the top tree to the buckhorn handlebars the gauges, all the nacelle is all off in under an hour. I would say about 45 minutes to get to this point. Now we're gonna show you guys how to hide and make your wiring look good. Let's get into it.
Next, we're gonna remove the fairing. We're gonna show you step by step how to do it. Follow along.
As Juan said, first we're gonna start out removing the windscreen.
So it's just these 4 Phillips screws. The trim comes off and then so will the windshield. Next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna remove this trim piece. There's no hardware securing it. You're just gonna lift up from this vent. It should be 2 snaps holding it in, just like that. Next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna disconnect the turn signals. There are these 2 plugs right here. So next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna remove the speaker grills. Make sure you use a microfiber cloth. Should just pry right out. So these are the 2 clips. Make sure you keep the gasket in place and you just set it aside. We're just gonna repeat that same process on this side. Next thing we're gonna do is gonna remove these 2 Torx screws.
I'm gonna jump in with a T27, start removing this, being careful that I do not hit the inner fairing at all.
Also be careful not to damage the speaker. They could be pretty delicate.
All right, so next we're gonna remove these little windscreens with a T25.
Gonna do the same thing on this side. Right. There it is. Now the next thing we're gonna do is remove the bolts from the turn signals. The turn signal is not gonna fall off. It's just securing the fairing to the bike. So don't worry about holding it.
All right, so Juan is removing the last bolt connected to the turn signal. And as you can see, the fairing is already wanting to come off. I'd advise you to have somebody help hold the fairing up while that last bolt is coming off.
Just like that.
Put this somewhere safe that it's not gonna get scratched.
I like putting some of the hardware back where it goes so we don't lose track of it. We've kind of removed a lot of bolts, so I'm gonna put these back. So this is the antenna. We're gonna remove this bracket. It's just these little pins, so you have to like wiggle it back and forth. It's gonna come off just like that. There it is. To remove the headlight, it's just these 4 Allen bolts. We're using the extended reach 3/16 to remove the headlight bolt. So we remove the 4, headlight comes off. It's just this plug here. Be careful not to break it. Headlight's out. We removed the headlight so we could bring this harness in. This is what's gonna allow us to hide it and clean up the wiring. So you could see the main harness. We're just gonna push it back.
All right, so we have made it to the peak of the mountain. All of the stock parts are off. All of our new components are right here. We are gonna clear this table and we're gonna start taking off the controls from the handlebars, pulling the wires through, pull the stock gauge off of the stock nacelle. Let's get into it. All right, so now we're gonna take the gauges out of the stock nacelle. We're gonna do that with a Torx, and this is the T25. All right, so now that I've loosened the Torx, I will then have the gauge out.
So we're not gonna reuse that hardware. Our kit comes with its own hardware. Another thing we're gonna do is we could remove this trim. It won't be used. It just comes right off. First part of this process is we're gonna install the gasket.
So when we removed the stock kind of chrome bezel it looks like it has, there is a foam gasket. This is also a rubber gasket that will then press against our bezel and the gauges, creating a watertight seal. Also, it will reduce vibration.
You wanna make sure there's no dust on the faces so you have a good surface to adhere. For the gasket, you're only gonna use the outer trim. You're not gonna use the inside. Get rid of it. We're gonna use the straight surface to line up the gasket. Now that we have the gasket installed, we can start assembling it. We provide the hardware that's needed. You wanna use a little bit of blue Loctite, and let's put the carbon backing plate on it. All right, so we just buttoned this up. Now I'm gonna set this aside and we're gonna take care of the handlebars next.
Now that we're diving into the bars, there's one last zip tie holding this together. You're gonna wanna undo that so they're easier to pull through. And then you're gonna start loosening the hand controls with a T25. Some of you may wonder how to take this off. On this this switch, you just push to the side and it actually comes off that easy. Then this will come off. There is a little clip kind of holding the switches on. You're gonna get under there with a pick, lift it up. And now is the time to start pulling the wires through. And then you can see one feeding it from that side. And there you go. I have the left switch out, cable in. You don't need to de-pin it or anything. Let's do the next one. Cool, now that I pulled this switch off, you're gonna notice this is where the throttle is. The throttle by wire is right there. So we do have 2 cables. So you're gonna start kind of taking both out at the same time. Again, don't pull too hard while doing this. Finesse it out so you don't rip any cables. There is the throttle by wire. You will notice that when I pulled one through, one of the orange gaskets or seals did come off of the connector. You can always put that right back on. Make sure that they do have the seals on there. So now here is the throttle side switches, and we can begin to put these in our new bars. The owner of this bike wanted to set a mid-bend bars on his setup, 4-inch rise, 25-degree sweep. My favorite handlebar, made in America, and we have the cutouts to do all of the wiring and the throttle by wire keyways. The nice thing is all the wires fit. Make sure you put the right ones on the right sides before you run the wires through and then you realize, oops, this is the wrong side. So you're gonna wanna get those going in to about that point, and then you're gonna wanna get throttle side wires. Make sure that you put them in correctly. Think about how you are lining it up. And then you're gonna wanna push the wires through at the same time. Again, kind of finesse it through, take your time, and you'll see that the connectors will start to pop through. Don't be scared to grab some needle nose, pull them up. Once you get it there, they start to get a little bit easier. There's the throttle by wire setup. This is actually, the plug that's taped off is actually for heated grips. And that's why this bike doesn't have heated grips, and that's why we're not using it. Now that the keyway is in, switch is on, you can see it would be able to go like so. Now we're gonna do the other side. This side will be a little bit easier. This is the clutch side. Make sure that it's the horn side. It's only one wire. And there it is. There you have it. Bars are wired, and then we'll keep moving on from here. Make sure that when you do put your switch housing or switches back on, the wire is routed in part of the switches when you snap this back on. So that way when you look at the bar, you don't see any of the cable sticking out. It goes inside the switch, right into the handlebar. All right, so now that we have our handlebars wired, we have our gauge in the actual gauge relocation. Now we're gonna open up the top tree and the risers. This customer went with the 9.5-inch pullbacks. Our Thrashin top tree, again, rad part. 2 locations where you can bolt your trees to. This rider sat on my bike and they decided that they wanted them closer to them. When you're at your house, you can actually play with that a little bit and adjust it where you want it to be. It's a great feature, great option. Lock is behind the door.
I was gonna assemble these really quick. Obviously it's not gonna be the final assembly, it's just to get it all laid out. When we do make the final install, we'll use Loctite. For now, we're just mocking it up. But these, like Lance said, this customer wanted them closest to him, so we're gonna choose that position. It's gonna come with the supplied hardware. Lance helped me with this. I am gonna put Loctite on these. They won't be coming off anymore.
Again, this tree setup does not need bushings. You're hard mounted.
So I'm just gonna snug these up to make sure everything's square. When you get the top tree, it's gonna have these bolts installed. We're gonna take those off and put some Loctite in them as well. So we're gonna get the tree mounted up. Let's do that. Let's move the wiring out of the way. Just like that. We're gonna hit the stem bolt to 25 foot-pounds. Next, we're gonna hit the pinch bolts on the fork to 20 foot-pounds.
All right, so now that Juan secured the top tree on with the risers, I'm gonna come around with the bars, and we're gonna slide these in there. All right, so the owner of this bike is about the same height as me. So what I'm gonna do is drop the cables down, and I'm gonna drop the bars into the risers roughly where I think they should be to try to minimize any scratching that can happen once you put that top clamp on. As you're clamping the bars down, make sure that it is centered. Hold them in place where you like them, and use an X pattern as you tighten down the clamp bolts. So once you've kind of snugged these down, you're gonna make sure, again, going in an X pattern, that you have 20 foot-pounds of torque on these 3/8 ARPs. Take your time while doing this X pattern. The clamp does kind of set into the handlebar, and it will kind of bite into the paint. You wanna make sure that your handlebars are really where you want them.
So now that you have your handlebars installed, we're gonna go ahead and install the mount. We'll add a dab of Loctite to both screws. Now you don't wanna put too much, because if you do, it's gonna come out through the top, possibly get on the risers. We're gonna supply you with the harness extension that's required.
Next up, we're ready for the gauges. I'm gonna let him put the harness extension on.
Let's plug this in first. Now it only goes one way, so make sure you plug it in the right way.
I am going to put a little bit of Loctite. Again, not much is needed.
Just snug it
Yep.
for now. Once we get the final position, we'll tighten
Come
it.
take a peek. You can see all the gauges, you can see the radio. Frick, that looks so good. All right, so we are about 2 hours in on this build right now. We've got the risers on, the gauges relocated, the handlebars internally wired and on. We're now about to start pulling the wires in to the front of the fairing. That way we can eliminate all this excess ugly wire that we're kind of seeing right now. Again, 2 hours in. I have a feeling about an hour and we'll be done with this build. Let's get to it.
All right, so now what we're gonna start doing is plugging in all the connections. As Lance mentioned earlier, the ones taped off in blue are the ones we don't need. These are for heated grips. But yeah, let's just connect everything. After that, we're gonna draw the remainder of the harness into the front fairing. Again, this only goes in one way. Make sure you plug it in the right direction. So we're not gonna use these two plugs plugged into here. As you can see, these are just dummies, covers, there's nothing there, so we're not gonna use those. The other plug that we're not gonna use is this one. That's the one for the key. Again, this bike got flashed, so we no longer need it. Just keep that in mind when you're plugging stuff in. So now that they're all plugged in, we're gonna start drawing the harness through, and it's gonna go into the frame. So again, this is one of the connectors we're not gonna use. We'll zip tie things right now, but I'm just trying to take up some of the slack.
All right, so you guys saw Juan just pull the wires through into kind of where the headlight goes. Before I let him button up and put the headlight in and put the wire sheath on all the wires to make it look good, I do like to test the bike. Make sure that the switches are all working. Make sure that when you hit the high beam, it goes on, hit the horn. Woo! Maybe even hit the flashers, hit the blinkers. Just kind of make sure that all your wires are where they need to be. Again, how rad is that? I'm able to turn the bike on and off with this. Badass. All right, let's keep moving.
So we're just gonna zip tie the excess wiring harness together. Trim off the excess. Just move it up and out of the way. Let's take off these screws. We can start putting the headlight back on. Again, just same plug it in. I'm gonna have Lance hold it in place. And again, we wanna Loctite these screws so they don't come off. All right, so we're just gonna clip this bracket back into place for the antenna. We're ready to bring the fairing back on.
All right, so now we're ready for the front of the fairing to go back on. Take your time putting it into place. Again, it's always nice to have a second set of hands.
I'm just gonna snug up the turn signal bolts. I already did it on the other side. Now we're gonna hit these two that are inside the speaker area. again, we're just hand tightening them for right now.
So now that Juan has snugged up those 4 bolts, I am going to plug in the blinkers now that I'm up here. Both blinkers are plugged in now, and I trust the fairing's not going to fall off. Let's keep moving.
Now we're going to install the wind deflectors. Start both screws before you tighten either one of them down. Again, be careful when handling hardware on speakers. It's really easy to damage them. All right, now that this side's done, we're going to install the grill. It's going to be the opposite of how we took it off. We're going to clip this side first. Now that the grills are installed, we're going to install this top cover. You need to engage this lip first. Make sure it goes in there. Now we make sure we're aligned over here. Now we're going to drop the windscreen on and the little trim piece.
All right, so now we're gonna go ahead and throw the Thrashin bolt grips on. I recommend getting a motorcycle grip glue, getting it in the grip, make sure it goes all around the sides and at the bottom. You wanna do this quickly, put a little bit on your handlebars and then get it on there. Make sure you spin it a couple times so that the grip glue gets everywhere you want it to be, and then set the grip how you want it. You can come through and wipe any excess grip glue that is left behind. All right, so now that we have the clutch side grip on, we're gonna put the housing on. Note that the housing does clamp over the grip. You're gonna kind of leave this snug. You're not gonna wanna over tighten this right now until you get your lever on and see kind of where you want your lever to sit. Perch clamps. So like I said earlier in the video, the stock trees are really long and they're pinned for clocking. You can see if I tried to put it on, it's gonna go into the bend, won't even let me sit flush, and we don't have the hole for the clocking. I wouldn't want that anyways. I wanna put the lever where I truly want it and not where Harley's telling me to put it. So here we have the Thrashin perch clamp, billet, made in America, and ARP hardware. All right, so make sure that your housing is fairly loose while you're getting all of this buttoned up, and you're going to kind of tighten everything simultaneously. So it took a little finessing to kind of get all this to come together. You kind of get it snugged up, get the lever kind of where you want it, and then go back to tightening the housing. All right, last thing to button up on the left side is you're gonna put the kind of button back in, snap it into place. Now you know it works. Let's go ahead and move over to the throttle side. We'll put the throttle tube back on, housings cover, and the lever. So now we're on the throttle side. We got our grip glued on. We're gonna slide it onto the throttle tube, make sure that it spins freely. Then we're gonna put the switch casing back on. We're just gonna do this lightly, just kind of get the threads going. Again, this is still loose till we get the lever put on. We're gonna grab the perch. We're gonna kind of nestle them in there together. Drop the ARP bolt in there. We're almost there. All right, so we're gonna get the levers set to roughly to where they're even, where I like them, right about there. All right, it's Juan's turn to snug this up. Keep in mind that when you are snugging this up, that there can be a gap at the top and bottom. We do like to secure that the gap, there's a less of a gap at the top, more a gap at the bottom, but again, you don't want them to touch, because if that was actually touching on both sides, then it actually wouldn't create a hard clamp onto the handlebar where they're not gonna move. 3 hours in on this build, really getting stoked. It's almost there. I could probably pull the tank cover off. We're gonna double check that the risers are tightened, and we're gonna put a sheath around the cables, take off all the protective tape we did, take the tank cover off, and check it out. So while he's down there with a long extension, securing and making sure that the riser bolts are tight, it is very difficult to get a proper torque spec because of how many extensions you have and how low you're actually tightening it. We do recommend tightening these very tight. They are 1/2-13 bolts. They can handle quite a bit. I always call it dad tight. Just put Loctite on it, make sure it's very tight, and you'll be good to go.
All right, so we're gonna go ahead and throw the sheath on. Before I do that, I'm gonna peel this tape that's on these cables. Just gonna hop clean it up. But if you wanna clean it up a little bit, we ended up doing some more electrical tape on there. Kind of hides a little bit more of the cables. I'm gonna use more electrical tape to close off the sheath, just because it looks a little bit cleaner than zip ties.
All right, under 4 hours and we did it. Top tree, new risers, gauge relocation. We rewired the handlebars. We put new grips on this bike. We did it all safely. We can start tearing off all this plastic. And the last and final bit, you ready, one?
I'm ready, hit it.
The gas tank cover. Look at that. And there you have it, 4 hours and we did the whole swap. Top tree, risers, gauge relocation, handlebars. I'm 5'9" with these 9.5-inch pullbacks, mid-bend bars. I have the risers set in the further back position, closer to the rider on our tree. I love this setup, super stoked, man. Honestly, I wish this was my bike, but it's a lucky customer of ours. They placed their order, they got picked because they were local. We threw it on for them so we can make an install video for you guys. Thank you for watching. Hope this makes it easier for you to throw it on your bike.